Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival for 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, self-reflection. Drawn from the Balinese Hindu philosophy of Mulat Sarira Angrasawani, it roughly translates as dare with sincerity to see one's shortcomings. From the 8th to the 17th of October, we will explore the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. I'm Julia Winterflood, and it's my great pleasure to welcome author Laura Jean Mackay, who is joining us from Aotearoa, or New Zealand, for the main program session, The Animals in That Country. This is the title of Laura's second book, which was released last year and received one of Australia's biggest literary awards, the Victorian Prize for Literature. It's been called a game-changing, life-changing novel. It's equally funny as it is disturbing, and will undoubtedly make every single reader think differently about all creatures, great and small. Congratulations, Laura, on your win, and thank you so much for joining us again at the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival, this time on the virtual stage.
Kia ora, Julia. Thank you so much. It is such a delight to be back at Ubud. Of course, I would love to be there with you in person, but joining you in this way truly allows us to be global. So it's such a joy to be part of this.
Thank you so much. Now, this isn't the first time that you've joined us at the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival. I'd love to hear a little bit about your first experience here in Bali and what you experienced at the festival.
I actually came over to the festival for the Bali Emerging Writers Festival, which was a linkage between the Emerging Writers Festival in Melbourne and Bali. And it was such an amazing experience to meet emerging writers in Bali. At one point, we had an entire room filled with people all doing writing exercises and workshops. And there was just such a lovely feeling in the room. And I also traveled through the country up to the north, sort of on a bit of a road show with the Bali Emerging Writers Festival. And it's an experience that I never forgot. And also it meant that the next year I came back to the Ubud Writers Festival and joined in again. So I had these 2 lovely years of being part of that festival and just really loving Indonesian writing and writers. And when I came back the next year, actually, for the Ubud Writers Festival, I was part of the Women of Letters Roadshow, and we travelled through Java, and I was teaching a series on letter writing and engaging with writers on the art form of letter writing, which of course is a very great tradition in Indonesia.
Absolutely. Well, when you're a return guest at the festival, then we know that you're very much appreciated. So we love to have people back, and then you definitely become part of the family.
What a great family.
Indeed. So to start off, I'd love to hear from you a brief summary of your novel, The Animals in That Country. We just, without giving too much away, of course, but just to give our listeners, give our audience a bit of a picture of this wonderful novel that you've written.
Oh, thanks so much, Julia. So The Animals in That Country is told through the eyes of a woman called Jean. And Jean is a person who likes to drink and smoke, and she has a lot of heart. She loves her grandchild, and she has a lot to give, but she really struggles with other people. The beings that she relates more closely to, apart from her grandchild, are animals. And luckily she works in a wildlife park in the Northern Territory of Australia. And while this is playing out and we're getting to know Jean, we hear word that an epidemic is beginning. It's called zoo flu, and one of the symptoms of zoo flu is that people can finally communicate with other animals. And at first, Jean thinks this is going to be a wonderful thing. She'll be able to speak with her favourite animal, which is a dingo called Sue, who lives in the wildlife park. But of course, as we would find out if we could actually talk to animals, they're not saying what we hope they would say. They have their own lives, they have their own thoughts, and the things they have to say are sometimes more violent and intense and incomprehensible than we hope. But Jean ends up on a sort of road trip through the centre of Australia with this chatty dingo called Sue. And so the story, and I think this is, my work is always about this, the story is really about relationships and friendships, and also about power and who holds power at what time, and how language can change power dynamics, even between species.
There are so many things to unpack in this novel, but how about we begin with the title and where you took the inspiration for the title from?
So the title is actually the title of a book of Margaret Atwood's called The Animals in That Country, a book of poetry from the 1960s, and there's a poem of that title as well. And I really love Margaret Atwood's poetry. I don't think she's known for her poetry so much as her books like The Handmaid's Tale, but it's very sort of robust and clear. And in this particular poem, she says, in this country, the animals have the faces of animals. And then later on in the poem, she says, in this country, the animals have the faces of people. And I thought that was a really, when I found that poem, I thought it was a really good way for me to understand what I was trying to do in the book. Of course, animals have their own faces, you know, they have their own lives, but we often place our own meaning onto them, and we try to make other animals about human meaning. We try to use them for our own wants and needs, but they are their own beings, and that's what I wanted to bring out in the book primarily.
I see. Now, I'd love to hear a little bit about a particular encounter that you had with a very small creature, a mosquito, and the kind of influence that it had on the shaping of this book.
So this question takes us back to Bali. As I said, I came to Bali with the Emerging Writers Festival, and after the festival, or between festival times, I had a little break. So I was sort of having a little holiday. I'd never been to Bali before. I got up early. I was so excited, and I was in the north of the country, and I went for a dawn walk. And I feel that was the moment that I met a tiger mosquito. So you would know tiger mosquitoes, Julia. They have their stripy legs, and they tend to bite at dawn and dusk. And they carry chikungunya, which is a disease quite similar to dengue. They're sort of cousins. And I turned bright red. I had a raging fever. I can't believe they let me back into Australia with the way I looked. And you know, these days, you know, alarms would go off with the fever I had. My skin started peeling off my body, and I became so delirious that I was convinced that I was turning into a mosquito. And finally, I was diagnosed with chikungunya, which aid workers like to call dengue on crack. It's not as deadly, but it does last for a long time. And so I was lying, you know, prone for many months, and I could barely move. But at the same time, of course, because I'm ridiculous, I was still writing. And my grandma bought me this voice software so that I could dictate my novel, because I couldn't move my hands anymore, because with chikungunya, you become polyarthritic all through your body. So I was lying there in extreme pain and delirium, But also, oddly, it was quite beautiful because the people in my novel started getting sick with this disease that I'd made up, this zoo flu, and I was quite sick. And so we went on this parallel path together. So I wasn't just writing the illness for my characters, I was living it. And in a way, it really, really helped me to understand what I was going through, because not much was known about chikungunya in Australia at that time. And it also helped the characters to sort of embody that feeling of becoming sick and taking on new symptoms. And I'm not saying that, you know, anybody should or wants to get sick, but it was a really good way to try to understand what was happening in my novel and also what was happening to my body.
Of course. I'm interested in the technique that you were forced to use because, of course, you're in too much pain and you couldn't actually use your hands. And so had you ever done any kind of alternative methods of writing before this voice to text? Had you done anything like that in your writing career?
Not really, but I'd wanted to. I am really interested in getting the writing off the page sometimes. I'm a big fan when I'm teaching writing. I always tell students to try to, print their work out or handwrite it sometimes, just to get off that screen and that quite limited place. And during that time, as well as doing the dictation, my grandmother actually died, and we were very, very close. And I was sort of going through grief and after illness, and once I could use my hands again, I started making up songs. So I got a piano and started making up these animal songs because I was trying to work out how the animals would speak on the page. I'm a terrible songwriter. You don't ever want to hear me sing, but it was a way for me to try and get off the page, and then I would try and put it back into the book. So a lot of the, I guess what we might call animal language in the book has been through a number of processes, as you say, Julia, through the dictation software, through the songs, certain elements of poetry, which is, where I turn to Margaret Atwood. So it's been through a lot of iterations to get to this final stage.
It's really quite remarkable that a creature as small as a mosquito could have such a monumental impact on your writing. But that's a big part of the book as well, just how significant and meaningful these creatures can be when so often we just see them as one-dimensional domestic characters in our lives. So I'd like to speak now about another animal that also had a very big impact on your writing. And this one, much larger than a mosquito, this one, a big grey male kangaroo. Can you please tell me about the encounter that you had with this quite impressive creature?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you know about the kangaroo, Julie. This is great. So this is way back before, years before I'd really started writing the novel. I was on a writer's residency on the edge of Melbourne in Australia and living in the bush. And I was really just starting to think about how humans were with other species and how we might communicate it with each other if we could, just really starting those early thought experiments. And I was going for a walk one night to the car along a very dark path in the bush. And I came face to face with a male kangaroo who was the same height as me. And a male kangaroo by themselves, through the stories, is supposed to be quite a dangerous creature. They might have strayed from their mob. So they might be lonely and hungry and unhappy. It's not an encounter that you would normally want. But for some reason, we just stood and faced each other and sort of tried to edge around each other like you do when you're entering a door of a restaurant and you both do the dance one way or another. And eventually we sort of found our path and politely went on our way, and he went off to eat some grass and I went to the car. And I didn't feel fear, and it didn't seem that he did either. And we both should have been very scared of each other, me because of his reputation, but also because of what humans, in Australia do to kangaroos. They're often shot if they seem to be dangerous. And I thought later, if I could have an encounter like that with a member of a completely different species, and we could have some shared connection and shared understanding, what would happen if if the language barrier was taken away and we could actually speak to each other. I think that because I also thought that if I'd been alone by myself on a path at night and I'd come across a male human, I would have, I wouldn't have felt so calm. I would have been quite nervous. And yet here I was having a very calm experience with this kangaroo. And so that led me to write a story in the voice of a kangaroo. And that sort of opened up this whole area of inquiry about, and after that I wrote a short story about chickens and a few different, about cows, until I finally started to find my pathway into this novel after a few years. It was a very significant encounter for me. I've never forgotten it.
I see. So we've discussed a little bit about the language of animals in your book, but now I'd like to focus on the protagonist, Jean, and particularly her incredible ability to hear and listen to animals. And this is before she's contracted the virus and can actually understand snippets of what they're communicating. But before this, she really listens on a much deeper level to everybody else. And we've chosen an excerpt that really epitomizes Jean's amazing ability to listen to animals. So if you could please read that paragraph, that would be wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so so this is Jean, and her granddaughter Kimberly often comes to stay over on Thursday nights to give Kimberly's mum a break, and Jean really looks forward to Thursday nights the most of all. She locks away all her beers. She puts away her smokes. She makes a nice dinner. She puts on a nice top. It's her night. I always want to wake Kimberly up to hear the creatures that only come out after she goes to bed. The wild rock rats gnaw something outside the kitchen window. The wallabies edge forward with their short front legs. The owls, and sometimes, but not often, a magpie goose with its sobbing laugh. Sugar gliders crab at their enemies, the sound in their throats like gravel being shaken in a plastic container. Insects scream past. Can I hear pythons slithering over my roof, hunting the rock rats that either don't get caught or have such big families they're always replaced? Can I tell where the grubs and centipedes burrow into the ground? Can I hear the naughty cats on their velvet paws sliding through the undergrowth, stalking pythons that stalk the rats? It's like the old woman who swallowed the fly out there. Through it all tonight, the dingoes keep howling. They don't normally do that. Dingoes are dawn and dusk callers. I go to the window for a cheeky fag and listen to those ancient voices. Something's up.
Thank you so much, Laura. Now you have a PhD from the University of Melbourne that focusing on literary animal studies, and it's very clear from what you've just read from the protagonist Jean's narration that you also have the ability now to see and listen to animals in a very different way than perhaps most people do. So can you please share with us a bit about this PhD of literary animal studies and what you love most about it?
So literary animal studies is such a lovely area. It's an area where we really focus on the relationship between humans and other animals, and it was something that I didn't know about before I studied. But I would start to go to conferences with these people who were engaged with this sort of study, and sometimes people would bring their dogs. I remember at one conference, someone arrived with a dingo from a dingo rescue centre, and I sort of tapped someone on the shoulder and said, there's this huge canine. And I said, is that a dingo? And they're like, yeah. That dingo often comes to the conferences. So, it's a place where people who are very engaged with the study of animals can really sort of embrace that. And there's also an activist side, that advocates for human-animal relationships. So on the one hand, I was doing this very sort of academic study, trying to grapple with the way that people had written about animals in the past, and the way that that we might go into the the future with that. But also, on the other hand, I was having these very physical research experiences. So one of them was in getting an artist residency in the Northern Territory at a wildlife park there. I was so lucky to be invited to go to that residency and live in the wildlife park in a caravan, and be able to engage with the animals that were part of the sanctuary there and get knowledge from the rangers working there. But also, as you would know, Julia, from your time in the Northern Territory, there are always wild animals everywhere, and the nighttime is when things often come alive. So I remember lying in my caravan and listening to the call of the barking owl, who was in an enclosure in the wildlife park, and then hearing the call of the barking owl, the wild barking owl overhead. So there'd be woof woof from down here, and then woof woof from up here, and these two intersecting creatures living very different lives. Outside the caravan, you know, I could go and see the enclosures with the pythons and crocodiles, and then outside the caravan, there was a olive python who appeared every day between 2 and 4 p.m. who would lie across my pathway to the bathroom. So between 2 and 4, there was no going to the bathroom because there was this giant 3.5 meter python just sort of there sunning herself. You know, and that's that shift in power that I'm really interested in. That you know, she's in danger, that olive python, very much in danger from humans. But in that moment, she also held the power of that space. That was her space on the step in front of the bathroom, and no one was very keen to move her. So that sort of research, I did use some of those anecdotes, you know, in my thesis, but that sort of research is sort of the voice and the fabric of the novel. Even if I don't necessarily talk about the character of Jean coming across a python in that way, in a way that python is slithering through the language and really influencing the way that I write about those power dynamics.
So you obviously spent a lot of time around all sorts of different animals. And I'd love to know about the ways in which you are formulating their particular modes of communication. Because while all of the animal communication in the novel does take a similar form in that it's quite fragmentary and it comes across almost as poetry, but each particular species very much has its own voice. The mice speak very differently to the sea eagles, and the sea eagles very differently to the crocodile, to the python. So did you really try and imagine yourself as those creatures when you were formulating their voices?
Yeah, I was really, I mean, character is the way that I get into any story, whether I'm writing or reading. And so I was really interested in how we portray animal characters as seriously as we do human characters in novels, because literary history, at least Western literary history, has been very, very much focused on the human experience. So I wanted to look at, which is part of literary animal studies, I wanted to look at de-centering the human and allowing the animal to be centered and the animal voice to be centered, but not necessarily in a human way. I wanted the animals to stand out as their own characters, very distinct from humans, and yet treated with the same value. So I feel like I almost wrote I wouldn't say a separate novel, but a whole separate thread, which was the animal voices. And that actually came much later, after quite a few drafts of the novel. I came in and the mosquitoes were really the first voice that I accessed. I thought, oh, well, if a bug, you know, when a bug moves across the room, when a blowfly comes into the room and flings itself across the room and bangs against the windows, that just seems so joyous to me. And so I wrote that in all caps. And once I had accessed insect voices, it's not actually the way insects would talk. We have no idea how they would talk, but this is sort of a celebration of their bodies and how I perceive that they might talk. Then I could start to think, well, how might birds speak? Maybe I could use the nuance of italics to give them sort of a little bit of a sarcastic edge and that watchful way. And Sue speaks often in parentheses, so she'll be going along talking, I love it when you pat me on the back. No, I don't. She's got this sort of double side, which is her institutionalized side, where she's, she likes her meals on time and she likes to be in the lead and she likes particular humans. And then there's this other side, which is always wild. And that was something that I learned from the rangers in the Northern Territory when I was cuddling up to a dingo one day. And one of them said, you don't you think that that's a cuddly pet dog? And this is where the novel opens with this discussion. It's not a cuddly pet dog. That is a wild animal there, and you will never know when she decides to become wild again. So I really wanted to portray those double sides of Sue. And as you would know from Australia, Julia, dingoes hold a really sort of contentious place in Australian understanding. We give them a lot of labels. We call them sort of, they can be domestic or wild or native or new arrivals or pests. And they're treated in many different ways depending on which angle you come at dingoes from.
And is this the reason, or part of the reason, why you chose Sue to be this particular animal? Because Sue becomes almost like the star of the novel, while Jean is the narrator. Sue is very much the star, and for those reasons, I'm wondering if that's why you chose her character to be a dingo.
I'm so glad you said that, Julia, because that's how I feel too, and that's such a good way to put it. That you're right. Jean is the narrator, Sue is the star. Sue arrived by herself, really. There were dingoes in the wildlife park where I was living, and I was really fascinated by them. And there were two males and a female, and the two males, when I would go up to visit them, they would perform and do their thing. And the female just didn't want to have anything to do with me. She had her own thing going on, and she would always walk away when I arrived. And so of course, being a human, you want to know more as soon as an animal doesn't want anything to do with you. So I was really fascinated by her. So she really inspired Sue, even though Sue's, a fictional character. But in a way, I guess that influence just made it onto the page. And I was really struggling with Jean and finding Jean's voice. Once Sue arrived, she made sense of Jean. They're really companion animals together. They're both women Sue's a woman. They're both females of their species that are having a hard time. Yes, Jean is going through divorce and struggling with her dependence on alcohol. But Sue was born into the wild with her brothers, and then she was taken and put on show, and she's been looked at her entire life. And so they're both really struggling with these quite difficult pasts, and then they escape together and go on this almost Thelma and Louise like road trip together where they try to work each other out. So yeah, I love that about writing, and I'm not sure if you find that too, Julia, how sometimes you'll write a certain character and you mean for the writing to go in a certain way, and then other things will just appear and you don't know how they got there, but suddenly it makes everything fit together. And
then you have a completely different story.
Yeah, that's right. And you have to choose whether to go with it or not.
So back to Jean, and I'm really, really glad that you mentioned that they do kind of complete each other, Sue and Jean, because while Jean is a fantastic character and she's very funny and real and gritty and raw, and I love her devotion to her family in particular, but she is still quite flawed. And one part of the book really stood out to me as a bit of a representation of Australia's very problematic colonial past and present. And it's an exchange that Jean is having with Glenn. He's an Indigenous man, he's a park ranger. And Jean quite flippantly says something about totem animals. And then Glenn asks, where were you at the cultural awareness sessions? We've been doing them for 3 years. Wasn't that enough? And Jean just passes it off with, oh, they were on my days off. And I saw that very small exchange to be very significant and quite representative of perhaps white Australia's lack of awareness and knowledge about the deep connections and relationships between Aboriginal people and flora and fauna. So was that where you were going with that kind of interaction? How do you feel about that particular issue?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I'm so glad you asked that. So I want there's a lot of white Australian sort of representation that either completely ignores the legacy of Indigenous culture and present that is what we call Australia, or there are sort of, I see quite a few white characters parading through their novels, seemingly sort of very accepting and knowledgeable, and in a way that, you know, some people are, but that isn't really representative of a lot of white Australia. So I wanted Jean to be a flawed character. I wanted to show the reader that they couldn't necessarily trust her, and that she wasn't going to listen to the very good advice that she's been given by many people throughout the novel. And Glenn, you know, has put a lot of work into trying to help her to understand, you know, the country that she's standing on, and the world that she lives in, and that she can have another relationship to the environment around her other than the one that she has, and she will not listen. So you're right, that is a very significant part. And I was really grateful that my publisher was, you know, agreed that we should get a sensitivity reader for that section. So we got some great advice from an Indigenous sensitivity reader, who also made some adjustments to, you know, to sort of help Glenn's character come through, and for that conversation to play out the way that it should, and that I couldn't necessarily write as a colonial settler Australian. So yeah, that is, even though it's a very small part of the novel, it is something that drives the whole way through. And Jean's character is quite consistent in that way. She never really ever listens, and I guess it's hard
apart from listening to the animals. She listens to animals.
She does, but she doesn't necessarily take their good advice either sometimes. So yeah, it is a really significant part of it, and I wanted those flaws to be there very much. She's not a perfect character.
She's not a perfect character, and that makes her so much more real and substantial, I find. Now, I'd like to step back a bit and look at the setting of this novel. Now, Australian readers would absolutely identify the fictional setting as Australia, but it's not actually ever named as the continent of Australia, and nor are the different parts of the country. Instead, you've chosen to just use the terms up north or down south, out east or out west. And I was wondering why you made that decision.
I mean, that was a bit of a dig at what we call Australia. Australia, of course, is made up of hundreds of Indigenous countries, and it's you know, we live in a world where that you know is it's a colonized country, and the dominant governmental and media forces are white Australia. But that's also a construct, and so I wanted to look at that. But also, as I've said, I'm not an Indigenous person, so I don't have deep knowledge of country. But I also wanted to look at the idea of the land and the many different territories that might be made up from all different species. So human species have certain understandings of the way that Australia is made up, but a snake in the wildlife park would also have a very different understanding. So one of the rangers told me something about how snakes have a very, very particular territory that they follow, and if they're relocated, it's actually sort of very deeply sort of upsetting to the way that they understand territory. And we all know with koalas, if you have been to or live in Australia, you hear their rather sort of ungainly grunts and roars of the male koala, sort of saying, and I always imagine them just screaming territory, you know, to let that voice ring out and establish that, you know, this is my spot for as far as you can hear me. You know, this is my trees and my part. So I wanted to take away that that idea of Australia, of what we know it now, and explore it on a different level. But I guess I didn't want to be too obvious about it. But I'm glad that you picked that up. Thanks, Julia.
No, it was very, very effective, and even to the point where the same sort of cliches popped in about the latte sipping Southerners, which of course, having myself grown up in the centre of Australia, we hear cliches and all sorts of characterizations of people from different parts of the continent.
Well, I was very influenced by because I'm a latte sipping southerner myself, so I like to point the finger at myself. But it was lovely when I went up north because so I'm from rural Victoria in Australia, and when I went to the Northern Territory, people kept introducing me as that journalist from Sydney. And because I was neither a journalist nor from Sydney, but it was as though everything that was south was sort of this vague southern land. And I love that because people get so specific about where they're from, and if you're from Melbourne, which suburb are you from, and things like that. But there's this massive land and Tasmania as well. And again, that comes in with these different ideas of land and space and season. Once you go up north, the seasons completely change.
Absolutely. So I'd now like to turn to how during the process of writing this book, I've read that you actually became vegetarian. And I've also noticed that you've appeared on quite a number of podcasts dedicated to living a vegan lifestyle and to animal rights. So I'm wondering if you think there's been more literature written in recent years on similar themes, and what you think might be driving this. And I think this also really fits in quite well to the festival's theme of self-reflection.
Yeah, it's such a great theme for a festival, and especially in these times when we are all having to take a moment to reflect on ourselves. So yeah, well done, Ube, for having that great theme. There is what we call the environmental turn and the animal turn occurring, and that sort of the environmental turn goes back to Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, which was written way back, and people sort of chart that as one of the first Western texts anyway that made people really look at environmental degradation. And on the animal side, there's Peter Singer's Animal Liberation was a real turning point for this turn, and the turn is literally a turn. So it's the idea that we might be turning away from this look at ourselves to reflect on the world around us. So it is a self-reflection, but it's a self-reflection that sort of broadens out to take in our environment and other species around us. When I first started writing the book, I was really worried about writing a book about talking animals, that people would think it was silly or that's for children and adults don't spend time doing that. But of course, once I started looking into it, there were incredible novels and other texts already being written. Anna Crean wrote a piece called Us and Them, which was a non-fiction text which really started to look at our relationship with other animals. And there was a book by Eva Hornung called Dog Boy. If anybody hasn't read Dog Boy, I highly recommend it. Once I read that, I never looked at dogs the same way again. It's about a boy being raised by a dog pack in Russia. So these texts just started to really open my eyes to the legacy of literature that was available. But it is really interesting. In the last 10 years, I feel that what we call cli-fi, so climate fiction, has really started taking off. Works by James Bradley is probably a leader in that area. Alexis Wright is producing incredible work. The Swan book was such a huge influence on me. And in the year that the moment that I released The Animals in That Country, 2 other books came out: Mammoth by Chris Flynn and Erin Hortle's The Octopus and I. And we all had this moment together. We've appeared on a few events together where we realized we'd been spending the last, decade thinking about these animals and how we communicate that with them, not knowing that we would all bring out these books at the same time. So there's really a movement where people are starting to acknowledge that we're not alone in this world, but we will be if we keep going down the path that we're going, especially with the rate of extinction. And that loneliness that we would experience without other animals in the world would be horrific. So we need to start to address that.
Definitely. Now, we really can't ignore the fact that as the pandemic draws on, your book too is about a flu that sweeps across the land. But of course, all of this was entirely coincidental. You started writing your book well before COVID emerged. So I was wondering how you started to feel where parts of your book were actually becoming part of our everyday lives. In your book, there's panic buying, there's government mandated mask wearing, and there's also, and this really struck home, there's conspiracy theorists denying the severity of the pandemic, and there's even quotes that could come from people on Facebook in our everyday lives. So how did that actually feel? How did you experience that, seeing your book come to life?
It was so scary and strange because I was doing the final edits on the book just as it moved, from an epidemic and started leaving the borders into pandemic. And then the book was about to come out. It was just becoming more and more extreme. And I was asked to read the audiobook for, version of the novel. And so it all happened very quickly. And I flew over to Sydney. And it was just at the point where I thought, oh, maybe I should be wearing a face mask. It was, because the news was changing every day. And I got to Sydney and I was in a sound booth for 8 hours a day, reading scenes of panic buying and, government warnings and conspiracy theories. And then I would leave and go to a Sydney supermarket and there would be people in face masks and the shelves would be cleared and, all this new information was coming through all the time. It was so surreal. And I was also really worried, that I'd created this fictional novel about this, what I thought was a situation beyond my wildest imaginings, that seemed so, ridiculous and extreme, and that all these people were suffering globally and increasingly. And that I was really worried that people would be hurt by the content in the book or that they would be upset. But I had experience as an aid worker in a past life. So I had, done communications work around the SARS epidemic and things like that. So I guess I did have some knowledge of the trajectory of the way things were moving. And also I had an illness myself. So I was sort of, charting that fairly closely. So luckily, I think that it hasn't been too upsetting for people, I hope.
Good. I think it just really goes to show that this pandemic, it was never an impossible scenario. Just maybe less so than perhaps one day being able to understand what animals are saying. But it was just very much a confirmation that we could definitely have expected it. So I think we're going to be out of time soon, unfortunately, though I feel like we could keep chatting for the rest of the day. I'd really love to know what you're working on at the moment and what perhaps your next book will be about.
Well, I write into the darkness, so I don't know what I'm writing until it's finished. So I guess you probably would know as well as I would what it's about. But I can say that it's really lovely I've started a novel, and it's nice to be at that beginning stage again after spending so long refining the animals in that country and trying to get those the many elements that are in it as to a place where I was happy with it. It's really nice to just be writing, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I go there every day, and who knows. But I've also gone back to short stories again recently, which is my first form. It's probably my first true love. All the short story writers out there, it's such a beautiful condensed little form. You fit an entire world into a few pages, and so that's been really lovely to return to that.
Great. Well, I think a good time to mention your first novel, your first book of short stories, Holiday in Cambodia. So this must be where your past life as an aid worker comes into it. So for fans of the animals in that country, then definitely seek out a copy of Laura's first book as well. It's been so wonderful to speak to you today. Thank you so much. Really, really grateful that we had the chance.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you so much to the festival and all the writers and readers out there. I hope you have a fantastic festival time.
Thank you so much. So yes, thank you to all viewers for joining us for this main program session and for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Swati Saraswati Patrons Program. Extra special thanks to the festival's partners who made this year's Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. You can follow the festival on social media with the handle @ubud_writers_festival and visit ubud_writersfestival.com for more information about the program. Thanks again, everyone, and I really hope you enjoy this year's UWRF.